As director of the John Adams Institute, I have the honor to welcome you all for an evening with a lady who has served the public cause all of her life. At first, her domain was the national arena, but later she served her country on the global stage. This is when we all got to know her. In her book, Madam Secretary, a Memoir, Mrs. Albright recalls hundreds of people at many moments in her life. She mentioned two Dutchmen, and they are both here. A warm welcome to former Minister of Foreign Affairs, Josias van Aartsen. And to Gijs Bakker. Who is Gijs Bakker? Gijs Bakker is a jeweler who designed one of her famous brushes. I don't think she's wearing it tonight, but for us, Madam Albright, it's an honor and privilege to welcome you here on our John Adams stage. About tonight's program, there will be no intermission, and Secretary Albright will be first introduced by journalist Jan Donkers, after which Secretary Albright will give a talk for about 20 minutes. After this, Jan Donkers will interview Secretary Albright for about 20 minutes, and then you will be invited to ask Mrs. Albright some questions. She's told me she loves to discuss her views with you, the audience, and please do so. There's 30 minutes time, maybe a little bit longer. There are 2 microphones in the aisles, and please use them, so make yourself heard. Unfortunately, there will be no book signing afterwards, but there are signed books for people available. For now, please switch off your telephones, refrain from smoking, and Jan, may I ask you to take the floor? Thank you.
Is that okay? Yes. Thank you very much, Monique, and a very warm welcome on my part also in this beautiful location. And what a crowd we have tonight. During the last couple of days, I've been bothering myself with the obvious question, how do you introduce a person that needs no introduction? I have had the honor to introduce a couple of dozen speakers in this wonderful series of readings by the John Adams Institute and on other occasions also, but I've never felt more superfluous than this time. Our distinguished guest tonight has been a household name all over the world, not only during the 8 years that she was the high-profiled United States permanent representative to the United Nations, and then the US Secretary of State. But she continues to have a tremendous popularity, as is witnessed by the publicity that surrounds her visit to Amsterdam the past couple of days. She must have done something right. The occasion is, as you are all aware, the publication of her memoirs entitled Madam Secretary, a hefty volume that not only covers her years as a public servant, but also the years leading up to that period, her European background, her formative years, her marriage, and her subsequent divorce. It is a delightful book that combines petite histoire and world history in a very natural manner. If you like your world history colorful, personal, and insightful, then Madam Secretary is the book for you. For those of you that have not read the book, let me just give you some biographical background that may be lesser known. Madeleine Albright was born Mariana or Madlenka Kerbel in Prague on May 15, 1937. In 1939, the Kerbel family fled to England to spend the war years and returned to a liberated Czechoslovakia in 1945. Madeleine's father, Josef Kerbel, was a diplomat and a historian, and only a few months after the war he moved his family to Belgrade, where he became the Czech ambassador. But democracy, once again, as we all know, was only short-lived in Prague. And after the communist coup in 1948, the Karabel family moved to London, then to the United States, where they were granted political asylum in 1949. Madeleine studied political science at Wellesley College, and after having obtained her American citizenship in 1957, married Joseph Albright in 1969. 3 daughters were born before the couple divorced in 1983. Her political career started, in a sense, when she became chief legislative assistant to Senator Muskie, the Democratic candidate for the presidency at that time. And during the Carter presidency, she became a staff member on the National Security Council. Also, she was active in the campaign of another Democratic hopeful in 1987, Michael Dukakis, who lost against the elder Bush, as you all remember. In other activities, she was a professor at the Georgetown University, and she still is, and she was a co-founder of the Center for National Policy, a non-profit research organization. Then, of course, came the period that everybody knows about. She became the United States ambassador to the United Nations in 1993, and 4 years later was asked by President Clinton to become his Secretary of State. The fact that she was the first woman in that position lent a special importance to her role, as is evident from several episodes in the book. The 8 years in which she was one of the persons to dominate the world stage were, as you realize once more from reading the book, a period of tremendous changes, upheavals, and tragedies. With the Balkan Wars, the Rwanda genocide, and the Israel-Palestinian conflict, maybe the most tragic. In the years since she left office, she has divided her time between being a chairman of the National Democratic Institute and the Truman Scholarship Foundation, leading projects for the Pew Foundation and the William Davidson Institute, being a public speaker and a grandmother. And she wrote a book. I would like to conclude my little introduction on a personal note. I spent the spring semester of this year as a visiting professor in the United States. I am a great admirer of America and almost everything American, and in a sense I feel a failed American myself, often thinking that an accident of birth situated my cradle in Amsterdam and not in Texas or California or New York or even the wonderful city of Peoria, for that matter. I witnessed the events leading up to the Iraqi war and the inevitable war itself, inevitable because the administration had decided to wage it whichever way, on the American news channels and in the American press, and I became highly disturbed by what could easily be perceived and was described countless times since as a growing rift between Europe and the United States. I had never expected to feel American power as something to be afraid of, but the flaunting of ignorance of knowledge pertaining to the world at large, the refusal to see the root of problems, the dismissal of all those critical as irrelevant persons and institutions alike, made me feel very uncomfortable. The disdain of this administration for the opinion of its allies, the determination to go it alone that, as you recall, had already started much earlier with its sidestepping of all sorts of international agreements, seemed to set the United States on a course that may still change the world order indefinitely. We don't know yet, and much in that respect will depend on the dynamics within the American political realm. Reading Madeleine Albright's book has been, more than anything else, a wonderful experience because it brought back after that the sense of continuity that I longed for so intensely. Reading her book made me realize that the present period, the disdain for Europe on that side of the ocean and the distrust of American power on this side is not something permanent, and that it is a deviation, an aberration maybe even, from something that lies much deeper. And that is shared dedication to values, core values that we have in common, even if the United States is no longer the neo-European country that it was until only a couple of generations ago. There's no reason to fear the American hyperpower per se, as there is no reason to think of a European force as a counterbalance to that power. But perceptions on both sides need to change, and in the case of the United States, it would be wrong-headed to ignore the dramatic drop in popularity, not only in the Muslim world, but also in Europe. And at the risk of being accused of stealing her thunder, I'd like to conclude my introduction by quoting the final paragraph of an article that Madeleine Albright wrote in the latest issue of Foreign Affairs, because it sums it up better than I have seen it described anywhere else. Quote, "The idea that Americans, residents of the most powerful land in history, are now truly living in fear of bin Laden has failed to impress the majority of people around the globe, whose concerns about terrorism are dwarfed by the challenge they face in simply staying alive, despite the ever-present perils of poverty, hunger, and disease. The United States cause would therefore be heard more clearly and listened to more closely if the administration substituted bridges for bluster and spoke more often of choices relevant to the day-to-day lives of more of the world's people. That means spelling out consistently not only what Americans are against, but also what they are for, and making clear that this includes helping people everywhere live richer, freer, and longer lives." And with these reassuring words, it is a great pleasure for me and an honor to give you Secretary Albright.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much, Jan and Monique, for this invitation. And Josias, thank you very much for coming this evening. We are very close friends and have worked together, and in fact are now trying some track 2 diplomacy to see if we can bring U.S. and Europe back together again. Maybe we can deal with that in some questions. I'm deeply honored to participate in this lecture series, and I look at your list of previous speakers and I think, wow, it's more than a little daunting to share a platform occupied previously by such great artists as Saul Bellow and Alice Walker and Frank McCord and Amy Tan. And what is especially impressive to me is the lecture series with such great diversity. And one month you were discussing international terrorism with Paul Bremer, and later it's Sex in the City with Candace Bushnell. It is refreshing in any event to come to a place where American culture is celebrated, or even to find a spot in Europe where the possibility that Americans have a culture is openly confessed. And another reason that I'm very pleased to be here is that I very much admire John Adams and understand perfectly well why an institute would be named after him. But I must say that until I read David McCullough's book, I didn't fully understand how he operated as a diplomat, and I thought very much in terms of my own life as Secretary of State and how difficult it was to control special envoys, especially at a time when there actually was perfect communication and they could call home or you could call them. But in the days of John Adams, he went about his thing himself, I think without checking with Thomas Jefferson, and basically, I think, played a very large role in making sure that the Netherlands played a crucial role in assisting the birth of the American nation. And so I read it with great interest, but of course it didn't come as a great surprise because the Netherlands is an international citizen of the very highest order. Although a small country, it has made giant contributions to international law from Grotius to The Hague. And one of my first jobs as UN ambassador was to persuade skeptics that the War Crimes Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia did matter and that it could be effective. And one of my last successes as Secretary of State was to convince President Clinton to sign a treaty creating an international criminal court. And my newest prediction is that one day the U.S. will come to its senses and become a part of that court. I cannot tell in which millennium that might happen, but not even paranoia lasts forever. It is no accident that several years ago, when the United States and Great Britain needed a venue to try suspects in the terrorist bombing of Pan Am 103, we turned to the Netherlands. And it's typical of your contributions that the Netherlands had joint command of the International Security Force in Afghanistan earlier this year, and that Dutch troops now assist the coalition in Iraq. And it shows the respect in which your country is held that your current foreign minister will assume the leadership of NATO in 2004, and I promise to learn to pronounce his name. The Netherlands is also a leader in another area. A lot of countries, including my own, talk about the commitment to helping the developing world. But the Netherlands tops the list of those who back up their words with money. Few, if any, countries devote a higher percentage of national wealth to helping others, and you stick to your promises through good times and bad, and that takes integrity. So if it were not among the 7 deadly sins, I would urge every Dutch citizen to be very proud. As you know, one reason that I've come to Amsterdam is the city of book writers and book readers is to promote my memoir, Madam Secretary. And I think that whatever else it is, the book is every American, is very much an American book, but with a European twist, as Jan has mentioned. This is both because I am a child of Europe and because events over here were such a focus during my years in the government. And as you can imagine, I am very excited that the book is finally done. I enjoyed producing it, but it was hard work, a little bit like being pregnant for 2.5 years. And one of the things that really worried me while writing is the fact that so many of the biographies we read today are about people who, although very interesting, are also quite dead. And obviously I had to write about the past, but I didn't want people to think of me as a carton of milk that is out of date. So I say in the last paragraph of my book that when I'm asked how I would like to be remembered, I reply that I don't want to be remembered because I'm still here. And I still have much to say, not only about where we have been in world affairs, but also about where we're going. It so happens that my former colleague, Josias van Artsen, now serves with me on a very forward-looking body, and it's called the Aspen Atlantic Group. And it came about as a result of phone calls from the former foreign minister saying that, in fact, people were worried about U.S.-European relations. And so we now have formed a group of 11 former foreign ministers from Europe, the United States, and Canada. And we meet periodically to compare notes and discuss policy. And most recently, we issued a statement calling for transatlantic cooperation in helping to make Iraq a prosperous, open, and tolerant place. It will come as no shock to you that I am a firm believer in transatlantic cooperation. From my earliest days, I have seen what happens when Europeans and Americans drift apart. But I've also seen what happens when we stand together, lending strength to strength, combining the power of principle with the reality of power. As Secretary of State, I worked closely with Foreign Minister Van Artsen and other European allies to enlarge NATO and to reverse ethnic cleansing in Kosovo. But since leaving office, I have been worried by the fissures that have opened between the government of my country and some European governments, as well as significant portions of the public. I believe it is absolutely vital that we work on both sides of the Atlantic to repair that damage. And I'm confident we have the ability to do so, but there needs to be at least some convergence in point of view. In the classic outline of a play, the problem is presented in Act 1, the complications arise in Act 2, and everything is resolved in Act 3. In recent years, there has been a tendency among some European leaders to linger in Act 2, forever worrying, never acting, doubting, and delaying like Hamlet. During the same period, there has been a tendency on the part of the United States to skip Act 2 entirely and plunge ahead without acknowledging complications or fully considering consequences. And we need to somehow develop a synthesis of the two. We have to combine a willingness to act with the foresight to think, analyzing without paralyzing, and melding once again the best of Europe with the best of America. We could apply this principle to any number of issues, but with your permission this evening, I will limit my focus to an interrelated three. The first is Iraq. As we all know, the decision on the part of President Bush and Prime Minister Blair to go to war was highly controversial, dividing Europe and engendering suspicion and fear in much of the Arab world. I spent much of my 8 years in government sparring with Saddam Hussein, so I was pleased to see him brought down. And I'm delighted that the Iraqi people will have a chance to shape their own future. Because of Baghdad's prolonged failure to meet its obligations to the UN Security Council, I understood the why of the war. I was not sure, however, whether we had good answers to the other questions, such as why now and what next. I sometimes have the impression that for the Bush administration, history began on September 11, 2001. The White House is understandably focused on the 21st century dangers of weapons of proliferation and terror. The irony is that it may not be possible to lead in the 21st century without a clear grasp of the history of the 20th and earlier centuries. Under the Ottoman Empire, what became modern-day Iraq was 3 separate provinces. Differences now between Arabs and Kurds and Sunnis and Shiites are complicating every part of the reconstruction process, from drafting a constitution to creating a national army to defining the relationship between religion and state. The colonial experience has also made Iraqis distrustful of Western intentions. The language of liberation used by President Bush is nearly identical to that used by British commanders in the 1920s. The presence of Western troops on Arab land is a source of irritation to Iraqis and a rallying cry for extremists from many lands. The White House stubbornly denies what the world knows, that it underestimated the complexity of creating a peaceful and democratic Iraq. It has also refused to share control of that mission, even to obtain greater international support. This has made a hard job even more difficult. It has been said that a guerrilla force wins by not losing. A conventional army loses by not winning. Stalemate in Iraq is not good enough. We have to make steady, visible progress by creating order and curbing crime, restoring public services, and training police. And sooner rather than later, we must place Iraqis at the center of decision-making, so the Constitution they write is theirs, the electoral process they establish is theirs, the legal system they rely upon is theirs, and the future they create is of their own making. None of this will be easy. Iraqi reconstruction is far more likely to prosper as a project of the world community than as an initiative stamped with the label Made in America. But I'm confident that in time we can and will succeed. And the reason has less to do with military power than with the power of democratic ideals. While our opponents are peddling tyranny, poverty, and terror, we are selling liberty, prosperity, and peace. And if Iraqis are able to make a choice free from intimidation and fear, I believe that they'll make the right one. But their ability to choose freely will be created neither quickly nor without further sacrifice, and the price tag will be even higher than U.S. leaders are currently prepared to admit. In recent months, administration officials have talked a great deal about their plans for transforming the entire Middle East. And their idea is that a stable and democratic Iraq will become a model for the rest of the Arab world. They have suggested that dictators shocked and awed by American resolve will abandon plans to develop nuclear weapons. Terrorists will retreat or go into hiding, and prospects for negotiating peace between Arabs and Israelis will dramatically improve. The administration's vision is a bold one, and I hope very much that it comes true. But I think it's fair to say that we're not quite there yet. A decade has passed since Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and Palestinian Chairman Yasser Arafat shook hands on the White House lawn, and I will never forget that moment. The promise of reconciliation was in the air. The possibility seemed real that Arab and Israeli children would be able to grow up and grow old in security and peace. During his years in office, Bill Clinton exhausted himself and everyone around him trying to build on that historic handshake and bring into being a new and stable Middle East. He did not succeed, and some faulted him for trying too hard. Given what has happened since, I don't believe it's possible to have tried too hard. During my years as Secretary of State, there were half a dozen suicide bombings on Israeli soil, and each was an occasion for horror and captured the world's attention as families mourned and victims were buried. And I thought it horrible, but it was nothing compared to the anguish we feel now as the obscene has become routine and new bombings and killings are reported nearly every week. All this bloodshed has shattered the process for peace, but it has also underlined the logic for peace. At the Camp David summit in July 2000, the Israelis offered and Yasser Arafat rejected the best deal the Palestinians are ever likely to see. If he had chosen differently, Palestine would be a member of the United Nations today. Palestinians would be able to travel freely, and their airport and seaport would be operating. Instead, they have nothing but misery. Many people say now there is no hope and that the Israelis and Palestinians can never live together unless one side is crushed or the other pushed into the sea. And I don't believe that, and we should not accept it, because there is nothing inevitable about murder and mayhem in the Middle East. To seize the sword instead of the olive branch, that is a choice. To teach children to hate is a choice. To glorify murderers as martyrs is a choice. To dehumanize and disrespect the dignity of others is a choice. These are all choices. And what people have the capacity to choose, they have the ability to change. We cannot make the choices for those who live in the Middle East, but we can insist that Arab leaders cease to finance, shelter, and make excuses for anti-Israeli terrorist groups. We can expect Israel to defend herself while leaving the door open to peace. And we can search for an economic vision for the region that will give the desperate cause to look to the future with hope. And as the four-party roadmap envisions, we can support the creation of a viable Palestinian state with new and reformed democratic institutions. These breakthroughs will not happen immediately, but they must occur eventually. And Israel can never be secure as an occupying army, nor can it ensure safety by building a fence. And the Palestinians can never hope to recover the land they have lost until they defeat terror on the land they have regained. There can be no solution for either side through violence, and there will be no progress towards a solution without the active, creative, and persistent involvement both of Europe and the United States. It is vital for Europe and America to work together in Iraq and the Middle East, and the same is true in Iran. As you know, the International Atomic Energy Agency has uncovered evidence of highly enriched uranium at 2 sites in that country. The agency has given Iran until the end of this month to prove its nuclear program is intended solely for peaceful purposes. The IAEA, Europe, and the United States are all pressing Iran to agree not to enrich uranium and to sign a protocol that would allow inspectors broader access. Europe, unlike the United States, maintains an open dialogue with Tehran. It should continue using that channel to convince Iranian leaders that going nuclear would disrupt relations permanently and put an end to the investment, credit, and trade Iran so desperately needs. But does Iran truly intend to develop nuclear weapons? We don't know. We do know that Iran's nuclear program extends back more than 20 years. And we know that Iran's former president declared in a speech 2 years ago, in due time, the Islamic world will have a military nuclear device, and then the strategy of the West will reach a dead end, since one bomb is enough to destroy all of Israel. Iranian authorities now say that the Quran forbids the development of nuclear weapons, a rule they solemnly pledged they would not think of violating. The truth may well be that Iranian leaders themselves are divided about what to do. In recent weeks, they have issued a variety of statements, some promising cooperation, others expressing resentment, a few threatening to withdraw entirely from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and many just plain confusing. The true test, however, is not what they are saying at this time, but what they do over a period of time. The challenge for Europe and America will be to keep the pressure on, but to apply that pressure intelligently so that Iran is more likely to forego the nuclear option. And this means we must coordinate our policies so that they reinforce each other. In that way, and only in that way, can we reduce the dangers we all face together. Anyone seeking reassurance about the importance or durability of the Euro-Atlantic tie should bear in mind that many barriers were surmounted in the past. This is no ordinary partnership. This is the team that defeated Hitler, outlasted communism, curbed ethnic cleansing, and brought fully within reach the dream of a Europe without walls, wholly at peace, and fully free. It is ridiculous to suggest, as some have, that the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001 rendered these accomplishments irrelevant. On the contrary, I believe they provide the framework within which a new dimension in transatlantic cooperation can find its place. The differences between Europe and America are substantial, but there is also substantial agreement on the truly overriding issues of opposition to terror and weapons of proliferation, and support for democracy and human rights. In Aesop's fable, a lion hunts a group of bulls without success because he always finds them gathered together in a circle. No matter which way the lion approaches, he is met by horns. And then one day, the bulls quarrel and depart angrily to separate pastures. One by one, they are devoured. Certainly, as we look around the world today, we see no shortage of prowling lions. The question we must answer is whether we will choose to meet them with joined horns or in separate pastures. In making that choice, we must remember that it is not a piece of paper that binds America and Europe together, nor even a 50-year-old promise. It is not decades of toasts and pretty words. The bonds that truly link us go deeper than that to the very values that brought John Adams and the Netherlands together more than 2 centuries ago: a love of peace, a commitment to the rule of law, and support for the fundamental rights and dignity of every human being. We may live on different sides of the ocean, but wherever freedom's values are on trial, Europe and America belong on the same side, the right side, thereby ensuring through our unity that liberty is the winning side as well. Thank you all very much, and I look forward very much to your questions now.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Secretary, for these inspiring words. I'd like to start off with a question, and maybe just one comment about the format of tonight. I would prefer it to be not that I start with 20 minutes of questions and then you step in with everything that I have forgotten or sidestepped or deliberately forgotten. But maybe we can bind it up by separate subjects, so that I have a couple of questions. Maybe then somebody can elaborate or ask a further question about that subject, and then I have some other subjects that I would like to talk about. I would like to start with a question that goes back to your childhood. You were a child of only one when Chamberlain held up his famous worthless piece of paper. You must have seen it in the newsreels hundreds of times. I have here in my hand a paper signed by Mr. Hitler. Your early youth was heavily influenced by that treaty. And am I correct in thinking that also a lot of your political thinking was influenced by a repudiation, so to speak, of the policies of appeasement?
That is absolutely correct. And the theme that basically goes through my book is that I believe that it is essential to stand up to evil, and that if the United States stands aside, as it did during Munich, that terrible things happen. In my case, the dismemberment of Czechoslovakia and the free road to Hitler to begin World War II. And when the United States actually entered World War II, the tide was reversed. When the United States decided to let the Soviet Union liberate Central and Eastern Europe, the Iron Curtain came down. So the theme is one of the importance of active American engagement. And, appeasement is one of those words that I grew up with and that is often used too freely when one actually decides to talk to an enemy rather than always fighting. But I did definitely grow up in the shadow and with the influence of the Munich Agreement.
You mentioned, talking about the Middle East, that what were the words that you touched upon the ahistorical thinking of the present government, and then you said that the power of democracy, of democratic ideas, should supersede other powers. I did not quite get the gist of what you do. You are you behind the ideas of the present government that, so to speak, handing democratic ideas as a gift to the Iraqi people, after which it will be serve as a shining example to the rest of the Middle East? That to me sounds like a bit of ahistorical thinking, and ignores the complex realities of the complex historical realities, especially of the Arab world.
Well, first of all, I actually believe, naive though it may sound, that we are all the same, and that everybody ultimately wants to have a chance to run his or her own life, and that democracy is not just some Western habit or aberration, but that it is something that actually people want, but that there are many models of democracy. Other countries practice democracy besides the United States, and that it is impossible to either hand it as a gift or, more accurately stated in terms of Iraq, imposed by an invading army. And that it is essential to begin a process whereby at local levels the Iraqi people, who actually are quite sophisticated, can have the opportunity to make decisions about local councils, and slowly that the process would filter upwards, and that ultimately there would be some form of free choice and democracy. And I do think that the Middle East is the biggest piece of unfinished business that the world has. President Clinton told me to read one particular book, so you can imagine that I actually read it. And it was a book called The Peace to End All Peace by David Fromkin that describes the creation of the modern Middle East after the fall of the Ottoman Empire. The Middle East was created, in the simplest terms, by the British and French bureaucrats lying to each other about what their intentions were. And artificial countries were created, artificial royalty was imported, and we are still dealing with the consequences of that. But I don't think we should completely give up on the Middle East. And so I think there are various methods of helping to bring democracy slowly to the Middle East, but I disagree with imposing. You cannot invade and impose a democracy in Iraq.
I'm sure there'll be more questions about the Middle East from myself and from the floor, from the audience as well. I have a question. We talked about this briefly yesterday, and that's Thomas Friedman's devastating column about the what he calls the one-dimensional fight that the Bush government is fighting, pretending that the Pentagon can fix the problem of terrorism, and not realizing that by walking away, for instance, from an agreement in Cancun, he is walking away from at least a partial solution. I agree with him, in many parts of the world, and enhancing the causes of terrorism. Do you agree with that?
I do, and I think that part of the problem that we all have to deal with is that we are not clear about what causes terrorists. There are many hypotheses. There are some that say that it is just plain hatred of America, or that it is the result of people within their own countries who have an education and have aspirations but cannot carry them out because of their own kinds of governments. There is obviously the concern that poverty creates terrorism. And that column by Tom Friedman, I actually call him President Friedman because he has so many good ideas.
He'll be speaking in Amsterdam tomorrow. That one of the real rifts is the division between the rich and the poor, that is getting worse and worse, and the fact that Cancun was an evidence of the lack of potential agreement between the industrialized countries and the non-industrialized countries is a road that is paved in a way to bring disaster, which is why I began my remarks in talking about the fact that the Netherlands actually believes in foreign assistance and does a lot about it, and the United States, the richest country in the world, gives less than 1% of its national product to. And keeps promising to do something about that, but never does.
Never does, and I do not think that the Pentagon can fix it, and that the size of our budget that is now going to the military is, unfortunately, it is a trade-off between guns and butter, and it then does not go to the State Department budget or other budgets that are necessary.
Yeah. You mentioned the word terrorism and terrorists, and if I quote again from your article in Foreign Affairs, a statement that I fully agree with. That is why we must take now nothing for granted, you write there. We must be relentless in shaping a global consensus that terrorism is fully, fundamentally, and always wrong. No exceptions, no excuses. My problem with the terms terrorism and terrorists is that it's such a blanket term, and that it's with only a slight change in your point of view, you can use the word freedom fighters, as the Americans have often done, talking about the same kind of people. I mean, example, even you could say that the Jewish state owes its creation in part to the activities of what at that time by the English was called a terrorist group, that were Menachem Begin. Are you, in other words, my point is, terrorism is not a word that clarifies a lot. It is an ideological term in a sense. Are you categorically opposed to taking up guns against repression?
No, I'm not, but I'm categorically opposed to what I consider the definition of terrorism is the deliberate targeting of innocent people that have nothing to do with the fight in order to compel the party against which the freedom fighter or whatever is struggling in order to get attention. It's that involvement of the innocent people, whether they're on an airplane or in a stadium, that have nothing to do with the fight. I am not opposed to people taking up arms on behalf of their liberty. I am also very worried about another aspect of definition of terrorism, which is that the Bush administration definition of he who is not with us is against us, etc., gives cover to those who claim that everybody who fights against the central government is a terrorist and therefore needs to be eradicated, i.e. the permission that has been given to Putin to exterminate the Chechens,
Yes.
some of whom now have been joined by what I would call genuine terrorists who use innocent lives to perpetuate their cause, but many of whom are just struggling for more independence from the centralized control of Moscow. So I agree with you. The definition of terrorism is difficult, but for me, the very specific definition is if there are innocent people targeted for no other purpose than to draw attention to the cause and not as a way of fighting whatever enemy you have.
That's a very clear statement. Is there any question from the audience about, I would like to concentrate for this time on the Middle Eastern conflict. Yes, over there. And please go to the microphone.
That's a long walk. Madam Secretary, first of all, thank you very much for spending this evening with us. My name is Rem Korteweg. I'm a student of international relations in Utrecht. And I just have one question, a short question which maybe has a simple answer. One of the most quoted remarks you made during your position as a secretary was that you noted that the United States was an indispensable nation. And I was wondering whether you have the feeling that the Bush administration and the United States, in general for that matter, are finding out that it's not only the United States that is indispensable, but that it is Europe as a political entity as well in confronting the threats that we're faced with today. Thank you.
This is not about the Middle East, but
I will answer it as if it were. Let me say that I did say many times that the United States is an indispensable nation because I saw it on a day-to-day basis. Whether it was at the United Nations, where people waited to see what the American response was or the American initiative was, and in the Middle East, whether the United States is taking the role of being the honest broker, waiting to see what position we take. And sometimes the way I interpreted it was that I never said alone, and even an indispensable nation needs partners, and that the strength comes from having partners, and occasionally letting some other country have your way. So that there is the necessity of working with others, and that an indispensable nation actually is strengthened by its alliances. So I believe that the U.S. is an exceptional special nation. That does not mean that it is above the law and that it can act with impunity, but that its responsibilities as the richest, most powerful country, that we have obligations towards others, and in the Middle East, that we are the ones that have to take the lead in the Middle East peace talks, but that we need partners, and that is my definition of it, and that as the most powerful country in the world, we have to exercise self-control. I will take this a little bit further, which is that I do not believe that under any circumstances Europe will ever be in the position of balancing American power. You don't want to spend that kind of money on your military budgets. And it is a waste of energy, as far as I'm concerned. What has to happen is that you and we see each other as partners in dealing with the issues in other parts of the world. And the indispensability of the U.S. with its other partners is what I believe will create the potential for a more peaceful 21st century.
Yes. Is that about the Middle East? I'm going to be very strict. If not, you can have your question later. Yes.
Thank you, Madam Albright, again for joining us this evening. My name is Rhonda Bird, and I am former Wall Street, now housewife, permanent European resident, and so it's interesting to see the European version of things when you do live here as an American. And one of the things that I see may have been brought to my mind as an issue is the structure of the UN Security Council with respect to the decision to go to war, or the inability of the Security Council to come to some unanimous conclusion to go to war in Iraq. Do you feel, given President Clinton had an issue with even paying the bills for the United Nations and the problems that we have with the Security Council, that the Security Council may need to be revamped in light of what has happened within the Middle East in this war?
Yes. Well, the answer is yes, but let me describe how difficult it is. First of all, we tried very hard to revamp the Security Council at the time that I was there. I can't answer this solely in terms of the Middle East.
Of course,
okay.
of course. I will not be that strict to you. I will be strict to the audience.
Is that we thought that we should add Germany and Japan as permanent members of the Security Council and expand the Council in order to give more representation to the non-permanent members, allowing there to be greater diversity in the rest of the world in terms of representation on the Council. The problem, in many ways, were the Europeans. It began with the Italians, who actually came to me with the following argument. The ambassador from Italy said, "You can't just have Germany and Japan on the Council. Italy lost the war too." So, with that logic. Then, there were times on the Security Council when there were 5 countries from Europe: the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Italy, and some Central Eastern European country. 5 out of 15. That has got to be wrong. Then I had the very interesting problem that I would go to a European ambassador in order to ask for support on a particular position, and I would be told, "I'm so sorry, I can't help you. The EU does not yet have a common position." And then the EU would get a common position, and I would go to the same ambassador and I'd say, "Now can you help me?" And he, it was always a he, said, "No, I cannot, because we have a common position." So it was very frustrating. And if the Security Council is to be truly revamped and to have India as a member of the Security Council, which I think is correct as the world's largest democracy, then hold on to your seats. What has to happen is that a consolidated EU has 1 seat on the Security Council, which will never happen because the Great Britain and France will not give up its permanent seats on the Security Council. So revamping the Security Council is like the Rubik's Cube, you know. It is very hard to get it right. The U.S. has a very strange role at the UN. You know, we actually helped to invent it. We did not pay our bills. I found myself in the most uncomfortable position of calling for reforms and being told all the time that we owed money, bringing our dearest allies, the British, to say a sentence they had been waiting 200 years to deliver, which was representation without taxation.
More questions about the Middle East? Over there.
I have a kind of combined question. Secretary Albright, as a former student of yours, it's a pleasure to see you here this evening. Coming back to your indispensable nation and the partnership issues, if you look back to September 11th, it feels as though we had an unprecedented moment in history of a kind of goodwill, both in the Arab world, or pockets thereof, as well as in Europe, vis-à-vis the United States. As an American, having lived in Europe a very long time, I found it almost breathtaking, the support and the goodwill coming out of here, which we seemed very promptly to have squandered thereafter. And all of the discussions now in the Bush administration about their PR campaign, and maybe it actually needs to go a bit deeper than PR. As an indispensable nation, haven't we rendered our own policies with all the best intentions and the best ideas thereof ineffective, even within our partnerships, to try and achieve what we need to do, particularly in the Middle East, but even more generally?
Yes, I believe we have, and for the following reasons, which is that there clearly was an outpouring of sympathy for the United States, and even the French said that they were Americans, and so there was this real sense. But what I think happened, and this is what I write about in this Foreign Affairs article, is that the Bush administration took that and tried to push the international community to agree to things that had nothing to do with it. So first of all, there was the push to say that Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden and the whole Taliban issue was linked to Saddam Hussein, which, as far as I'm concerned, it was not. Then it pushed the international community to say that preemptive doctrine was all right, which to me is a very peculiar concept and a bad definition of what is the inherent right of self-defense of every country, pushed to an extreme that makes it unacceptable. It then pushed the international community to decide that a predominant American military power was acceptable even without any international support. And one step, which hasn't been discussed much, but is in fact a concept that is operating in terms of the U.S. military budget, the possibility that small nuclear weapons can actually be used. So the whole idea, the whole support for the United States was in fact dissipated as a result of analyzing and over-defining what that support was. And so I think it has, in fact, made it very difficult for the United States to count on support for things that we really need, because it's made choices. We have made choices that have forced other nations to make choices that they didn't have to make.
That's a subject of, I think, deep worry. Do you think how deep should we worry about the rift that has grown because of that?
Well, I think I am very obviously troubled by the rift, but I don't think, I hope it is not permanent. I also know from history that there have been times that there has been great anti-Americanism in Europe, and other times when there's been great anti-Europeanism in America. The problem is that they haven't happened simultaneously, which is what is happening now. But it behooves those of us who have some sense about the importance of America and Europe acting together to decide that this government of the United States is not forever, that there is the potential, I hope soon, of having a different approach by the United States, and that we have to be careful not to get ourselves into a mood where we make it worse. Now, I think that the United States has taken advantage, in some ways, of divisions that exist in Europe. We didn't make up the problem of how some Western European countries view some Central and East European countries, in terms of EU accession. We didn't make up the agricultural problems between France and Poland. And so when a Secretary of Defense comes over here and says that there's an old Europe and a new Europe, and he is then supported by President Chirac, who starts lecturing Central and Eastern Europe, it is two trends that are supporting each other in the wrong direction.
Mm-hmm.
So the question is how to create trends that go the other way.
Yes. It's also no fun being told that you're irrelevant as of now.
Yeah, with that.
Well, I have a question.
We are told that all the time in the United States, those of us of the other party.
You mean the opponents of the...
Right,
well,
yes.
yes. I have a question about the Middle East as well. Do you think that the present administration realizes sufficiently that the perception of the United States in the Arab world, well, let's say the Arab, as you rightly point out, and which is not enough known in the United States, nor in this part of the world, that the Arab world and the Muslim world don't coincide at all. But that much of the perception of the U.S., let's say in the Muslim world, depends so much on the perception, rightly or wrongly, to put it rhetorically, that it is with American weapons that Palestinians are killed.
Well, I think that it is an unfair point to make it seem as if the U.S. has no interest in what happens in the Arab world. We have worked, I speak for the Clinton administration, we worked very hard in order to do two things that have to be separated. The United States is Israel's best friend,
yes,
and in many cases the only friend. Yes. And we have been that friend since 1948 and are committed to the security of Israel. That is a fact, and we will always provide the military edge to Israel. That is one part. But the other role that the United States has and wants to have and should have is as the broker in trying to figure out how to get a Middle East peace. And there, we were accused, I specifically, of spending much too much time with Arafat, that we gave him too much respect, that we got much too interested in the Palestinian cause. And so I disagree with the fact that we are always in the position of being only on Israel's side, providing weapons without, in fact, helping the Palestinians. The Americans did provide a lot of financial assistance to the Palestinian Authority and did, in fact, want to see some kind of a resolution. But, and this goes back to our terrorist point, I do not equate a suicide bomber with a bulldozer. And I think that we have to be very careful in terms of the moral approach that we take to this. I do not think that Israel is doing anything, actually, to provide for its own. I think it's making itself less secure by its actions. And I think that the Israeli government has made a huge tactical error by isolating Arafat, whom I know well enough to know is having a wonderful time, because he loves being a victim. He is, that is his best role. And so to provide him with that pleasure is a big mistake on Israel's part. But I do believe that the United States still can and must have the role of being the country that tries to bring the two parties together.
If they were not to do that, there will not be any progress in our time, I'm afraid.
I don't think so, because no matter how much the Europeans try, and there have been, Javier Solana has gone there, and various European ministers have gone there, but in the end, the U.S. is the indispensable nation here, and has to play that role. And what I criticize the Bush administration for is that they didn't play the role. What would have been smart never would have happened, but what would have been smart is if President Bush had asked President Clinton to continue his negotiations. Yes. If he had succeeded, everybody would be happy. If he had failed, it would have been his fault. And so I think that it was a big mistake, and for 2.5 years, nothing happened, and more killings happened during that period.
Because just to refresh your memories, when the Clinton administration had to resign, the negotiations had to sort of crash landed, right?
And they dismantled the peace team.
Yes.
led by Dennis Ross, who knew every detail of everything, so that if Arafat said, I never agreed to that, Dennis would say, yes, you did. It was August 4th. You were sitting in that chair. We were having tea or whatever, and the same thing he did to Sharon or Barak or whoever. And that team was dismantled. And what is interesting is, according to the newspapers today, there have been private talks of some kind going on between peace-minded Israelis
And
peace-minded
Palestinians, yes.
Palestinians that, according to what I've seen in the papers, are the basic parameters that we laid down
Yes.
before we left office,
Yes.
because they're logical.
Yes, but they were repudiated firmly by the Israeli government.
Well, it's too bad.
Yes.
I mean, it's,
Well, Mr. Sharon
They-
is on record as saying that he loves the peace process so much that he wishes it would go on for another
Forever.
20 years.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, this is what I have to say about the Middle East, generally, is that the Palestinians as well as the Israelis are run by two stubborn old men who have hated each other forever, and they are not the right ones.
Could I ask
One last
could I-
question
Could I ask a
pertaining
question
to the
Middle
to-
East?
Yes, to the
Particularly to the Middle
Israeli
East.
Palestinian
had
conflict. Yes.
Loads of questions, actually, Madam Secretary. My name is David Katz. I'm a publisher. But your last remark is very interesting because you said, A, that Camp David was actually the best deal Palestinians could ever get. B, you say you know Arafat very well. And C, just now you said that now they're run, both countries are run by grumpy old men, etc., etc. Do you think that Arafat's decision not to take up on the Camp David offer and the launching of the Second Intifada was premeditated? And if it was, how can this current crisis ever be ended, preferably, obviously, with the help of the U.S.?
It's a tall order.
Yes. Well, I actually do not think it was premeditated, but I do think the following, which is that there are many questions as to why we went to Camp David. And there are those people who think that the only reason we did it was because President Clinton wanted to have a legacy. I happen to know otherwise, that it was because Prime Minister Barak was pushing to have the Camp David talks, and because it was more and more evident that the interim talks were not going anywhere, and people were afraid of an outbreak of violence. So that it was a risk taken in order to avoid violence. Which doesn't mean that the Intifada was premeditated, but that there was a sense of despair that was leading towards it. The other part about Camp David, and while you're not the publisher of my book, you have to read it, I explain that Camp David, Barak wanted to go to Camp David. Arafat did not. And I had to go to the Middle East and persuade him that that it was important to come to Camp David. He came with the wrong attitude. He didn't want much to do with it. He literally did nothing to present any ideas. Prime Minister Barak made very many bold and courageous ideas. And Arafat basically just sat there. The problem that I think, and it's wonderful no longer to be Secretary of State because I can tell you exactly what I think, is that there were, I will say, mistakes were made, and that is that Arafat had every right to make decisions about the size of a new Palestinian state. He, according to Palestinian selection, was elected leader of his people and could make decisions about the size of his state. But he actually was not in a position to make decisions about the disposition of the holy places, which are under the protection of the Saudis and the Moroccans primarily. And Barak was the kind of a person who, while bold and courageous, was secretive and didn't really give us enough of his bottom line ahead of time, so that we were not in a position to work enough with the moderate Arabs, so that when President Clinton and I started calling them, which we did in the middle of Camp David, they didn't feel enough a part of the process to put pressure on Arafat to make the deal. So that was the problem at Camp David. Now, if you read a variety of other books, you'll see that finally in December, January, they were beginning to put pressure on Arafat, but Arafat would not bend. So I don't think the Intifada was premeditated. I do think that Sharon's trip to the Temple Mount was a huge mistake, and that then because...
That was premeditated. Yeah.
Well, I mean, that was a political
Yes.
act.
Yes.
And that it did then call forth this volcano of anger and frustration, which was always kind of there, but suppressed while the peace talks were going on.
You have a lot of chance to put other questions later on. I would like to change the subject to a personal part of your book. It was only in 1997 that you discovered your Jewish roots and learned about the tragedy of 3 of your grandparents who were murdered in concentration camp. What I never understood is why this disclosure was, in a way, in the American press, held against you as if it were something that you had hidden.
Well, I never did either, frankly. But what happened was that there is something called gotcha journalism in the United States. And the interesting part was that I think the book shows that I am probably the least secretive public person that you've ever met. I basically told everybody everything. And so when Michael Dobbs, who was a reporter for the Washington Post, called me during the transition period to say that he wanted to do a profile of me and that he was traveling to Europe, I gave him the names of every address and person that I could think of, and was prepared to have a meeting with him after I was named secretary, because the law does not allow a secretary-elect to have public interviews until you're actually confirmed.
Yes.
And so he dug up this information and then presented it to me as if it were a criminal case. And it came at a very difficult time because I had just become Secretary of State. There was the whole question as to whether a woman could even think of being Secretary of State. So I had to deal with what was a very personal, painful issue to me in a very public way. I had some rumors about the fact that my family was of Jewish background before that, but people who travel with me now can see what goes on. People come up to me now and tell me that they're a relative of mine. Or
In Czechoslovakia?
No, in the United States, or that they need a visa, or a little bit of money, or whatever. And so as my name began to surface, I started getting letters from people that said that they knew my family and that they'd gone to high school with my father, for instance, when my father would have been 6 years old, or that my mother's last name was something else. And none of it made any sense. And then, and I discounted it. I also chose to discount one letter that came from a Serb who said I was a Jewish bitch, so I decided that was not worth taking seriously. And so then, at the end of November, when my name was really out there, I got a letter from somebody where all the facts really made a lot of sense, the names of the towns where my parents had been born, etc. And so I was willing to believe that I was of Jewish background, and as I was being vetted by the White House counsel, I said that, and they said, so what?
Which
seems
only
like
response,
the logical answer.
Yes.
And so I had the discussion over Christmas with my children, and that was that. And then this other thing, which I thought was particularly cruel, because the reporter first called my daughter and said, did you know that your great-grandparents died in a concentration camp? So the whole thing was very nasty and came at a very difficult time. And I write in the book about what happens in people's lives. There was this mixture of great elation, because it all came out on the day of the State of the Union message. For the first time in American history, I think people have watched the State of the Union on television. It's not a room dissimilar to this. And the sergeant at arms yells out, "The cabinet, the president's cabinet." And for the first time, a woman was leading the cabinet down the center aisle. And I was very proud, and at the same time, I wondered if I would lose my job because the thing had been made to seem as if it were a crime.
Mm-hmm.
And it was horrible.
Was that just gotcha journalism, as you call it, or was there a hidden agenda on the part of that journalist or that paper?
I don't want to believe that. I don't think so. Though there were people who, when my name was surfaced, had said that a woman could never deal with Arab men, and therefore I shouldn't be secretary. What was interesting was that a group of Arab diplomats at the UN said, "What do you mean? We don't, we deal with her fine here." Mm-hmm. I actually had more trouble with the men in my own government, so.
Well, you've mentioned how important it was, and you mentioned that in the book, being the first woman in a position of such huge, later on, I have one more, political power, and you described, I think it was either in the book or in an interview that I read, yourself as one of an interesting generation of women, a generation that in a sense formed a bridge. Could you elaborate on that?
Well, I went to Wellesley, which is
Yes.
a women's college, and I was a generation of women that wanted to get married right away. And I did, 3 days after I graduated from college. But I also wanted to have a career of some kind.
Yes.
And I really thought that I could blend it all. And I actually found a letter that I wrote, or an essay that I was writing in 1961, that was very clear about, I had just had twins, and I was trying to figure out what I was going to do with my life. I was taking Russian and trying to occupy my mind while I kept feeding these children. And so I was really of that generation that didn't know what we wanted. And I think we're very confusing to our husbands. And there was a study of the classes at Wellesley that ended in 9s, and it happens that Hillary Clinton is 10 years younger than I am. Mm-hmm. And her class was already different from mine. My class, we thought we basically could be interesting appendages of our interesting husbands. She, on the other hand, basically, she writes about this. Her generation already knew that they wanted to have careers, and if they got married, fine. So, and it turns out that my class had the most divorces. And I think partially because there was this kind of confusion.
Yes. So that's what you mean by being a generation that I
and
see.
And the hardest part that I talk about is that not only was I judged by my husband's employer, who said I couldn't be a journalist, and I agreed, which is a lucky thing for journalism, but that I was judged by women the same age that I was. Who had a capability of making me feel guilty because I was getting my PhD. And not everything is men's fault, I have to say. But sometimes women are very difficult on each other. And I have said that there's a special place in hell for women who don't help other women and who make judgments.
Yes. I have a couple more at the end, but first, gentleman over there, yes.
Yes. There was asked about your roots. I know by experience what that means. Not to be totally part of a country. I am from the East and from the West. The question I asked you, madam, is, do we need any ideology or religion, or it does not matter what, for to solve the problems nowadays? Because fundamentalism in the Middle East, in the West, nationalism, look to the former Yugoslavian countries. how do we solve these problems? Or do we need a total other philosophy, a really philosophy, to solve the problems in politics, social problems, economics, and not to fight against each other more?
Well, we probably do need another philosophy, but we're not going to have it. Because I think that what is happening is that there are two counter trends happening. And that is, there are lots of questions about globalization. We don't have a choice. It isn't as if we can say we don't want globalization. It's a question of how we manage globalization. And globalization and greater interdependence, I think, is creating a counter trend, which is that people are lost within such a large world, and that they then try to create groups that are just like them. You try to find a smaller and smaller group that is exactly like you so that you feel comfortable within this very large global world. And sometimes the group is one of religion, and sometimes it is of national identity, of which that's not a problem. I mean, we all like to feel secure within some kind of a group. But when love of your own group turns into hatred of the other group is when the problems come up. And the question is how we can teach tolerance. They have been working on that for thousands of years. And for me, the greatest tragedy is that religion, which should actually be a unifier, is a divider because people use the excuse of religion to kill each other. I know we're not talking about the Middle East anymore, but the perfect example is that as we were dealing with the problem of Jerusalem, a very small area in the middle of Jerusalem, where all the holy places are, is so complicated that God had to send 3 different messengers to figure out who belongs to what. So it is really this multiplication of the divisions in our societies that are creating the problems. It's not so much an ideology, but this desire to be with your own kind that then turns into hatred of somebody else. Kierkegaard.
Give me a sign when you're almost fed up with us.
I'm very happy, thank you.
Okay, then we have some time for maybe a couple more questions.
The truth is it's only 3:30 in the afternoon in Washington.
Oh, so we can... when will you have dinner, usually? Yes, once again over there.
Very quick question. You spoke about your distaste for appeasement. Do you think that the United States was guilty of that in relation to North Korea during the Clinton administration?
Can you repeat that last sentence?
Certainly. Was the Clinton administration guilty of appeasement in connection with North Korea?
Simple answer is no, because this is the issue with North Korea, and I often talk about North Korea, and I didn't today. North Korea is the most dangerous place in the world, much more dangerous to the United States and to Asia and even to Europe than Iraq. And we felt when we were in office, first in 93-94, when the North Koreans left the Non-Proliferation Treaty and kicked out the inspectors, that it was very dangerous. We were prepared to use military force, and then the agreed framework was worked out first by diplomat Ambassador Gallucci and then picked up by President Carter, and the agreed framework froze the North Korean nuclear program for a period of 8 years and managed to stop the building of up to what by now would be 100 to 150 nuclear weapons. I, very specifically, we were very concerned about the danger of North Korea to Japan in August 1998 when they fired a missile over the area, and once again reviewed our policy towards North Korea, led by former Secretary of Defense Bill Perry. And we knew that we had the option either of using force, and there would be a devastating war, millions of people would die, the U.S. would win, but the Korean peninsula would be a bloodbath. Or to offer the North Koreans the possibility of making verifiable agreements. The North Koreans actually chose the idea of verifiable agreements. We were in the middle of the negotiations. People who say that was appeasement forget that we actually don't make agreements with our friends, we make them with our enemies, and that we have arms control agreements with the Soviet Union, and that they cheated, we cheated, and we managed to work our way through a very dangerous nuclear period, and so it made sense to negotiate an agreement with North Korea. I am the highest level person to meet with Kim Jong-il. He is very peculiar, but he is not crazy. His hair is much poofier than mine, and we are
mine.
yes, certainly, and we are about the same height. We both wear high heels, and but we were in the process of making an agreement. And he doesn't understand democracy or that our foreign policy comes in 4-year segments. Some of you don't understand that either. And that it is, in fact, he didn't understand that we were in the middle of having an agreement of negotiating when the next team did not pick up the hand of cards. So I do not believe that talking is appeasement. I think that is the only way to deliver a tough message and make some kind of an agreement to try to diffuse the danger of North Korea.
A gentleman over there, and then Gary will have his turn. Yes.
Madam Secretary, in your book you describe a moment that you are visiting Prague for the first time after the wall has fallen, and how you wonder what your choices would have been had you lived there during the communist reign. You leave a pregnant pause. You don't answer the question in your book. And I was wondering what, in your deepest heart, your conclusion was.
Well, I don't know, obviously, because it didn't happen, but I would hope that my conclusion would have been that I would have been one of Václav Havel's group of dissidents, and that I would have been willing to sacrifice in order to bring freedom to Czechoslovakia. But I have watched enough people that lived there to know that they made compromises, and that people who one of the saddest parts about when they opened up the secret police files was for people to find out that the people that they thought were their active, friendly dissidents were not. And so I think it is for those of us that had the opportunity to grow up free, I think it is very hard to make judgments about how people behave when their families are threatened, and when one member is arrested. So, knowing myself, I would hope that I would have been out there fighting. But I think it's not fair to I am a fighter, and I would hope that's what I would have been. But other people that I know were not.
I have a question that ties in with that. Well, only marginally. Havel offered to mediate, trying to make you the new president of the Czech Republic. You declined. Why?
Well, for two reasons. One is I really am an American, and my book, I think, describes how much I wanted to be an American, and how proud I am to be an American now, even now, especially now, and that it's very important to me to be an American, and to have had the opportunity that as an immigrant is unexpected, to have the possibility to use American power to make a difference, to the goodness of American power. So that's one reason. The other reason is, it goes to the question that the gentleman asked, is I didn't live through that period with the Czechs, and I'm not sure it's fair, because no matter how I try, I wasn't there, and I don't know the pressures that I probably know more about communism and how people lived under communism than the average person, because it was my specialty. But I think that there's something different about having really lived through it.
Yes.
And Václav Havel and I are actually very good friends, but it is very evident that I grew up in America and he didn't. So I just don't think it's fair. I was very honored.
Of course.
And very surprised because I'm standing there next to Václav Havel, whom I adore, and he suggests it, and I can't just say, "You got to be kidding." It was a delicate moment.
Gary.
Madam Secretary, your criticism of the Bush administration is well taken. I share it completely. I would go further. However, both in your statements and in Jan Donkers, there's a kind of fond hope that when Bush is defeated, that things are going to turn around. And I'm really very concerned about other things that are happening in America that seem to undermine that hope. And that is a kind of militarization of American thinking and behavior. America seems incapable of undertaking major activity without calling it a war. There's the war on crime, there's a war on drugs, there's even a war on poverty, there's the war on terrorism. And these are not just metaphors for each of them. And there's even a kind of war by the American administration against its own citizens in the case of the wars on crime and drugs. Now, don't you think that something like this has to be reversed somehow or other before America once again becomes the great world citizen that we all admired for so many decades?
Well, I wouldn't go as far as you go. Some of it is terminology because it's the mobilization in order to get a vast population interested in something. I don't happen to call it a war on terrorism, not because I have a problem with the word war, but because it's not going to end. And there's not going to be a ticker tape parade at the end of this particular war. It is the struggle that we are involved in now as a society for the foreseeable future. I actually think that most Americans are not militaristic. On the contrary, one of the real problems has been, if you look at American history, is to get Americans interested enough in some other part of the world in order to actually do something about it. So Woodrow Wilson was not interested in World War I originally. President Roosevelt had to practically trick the people in order to be interested in World War II. I had a very hard time persuading many of my colleagues that it was worth fighting in Bosnia and Kosovo, when actually the Europeans didn't care about something that was happening in your own backyard. So I think that Americans are not naturally militaristic. What I do think has to happen, and I don't know how this is going to happen, because there's a real difference between me and Americans my age. And that is that I was born here, and that I spent the war in London in an air raid shelter, and that I come originally from a very small country that was invaded. And so I have grown up with a sense of vulnerability. The average American has not felt vulnerable until 9/11. And the psyche of that, it's practically impossible to explain to any European that all of a sudden this huge nation, that it was behind two oceans with friendly neighbors on the north and the south, that all of a sudden it wasn't impenetrable. And what it has done to the American psyche still is unbelievable, leading, I believe, some people to accept something which is truly bad, which is a limitation on our civil liberties. That is the part that makes America great. And at the moment, there are real questions whether people are willing to give that up. So the U.S. has a lot to go through, but I don't see it as a militaristic nation. I see it much more as a nation that is usually disengaged from the world and is trying to figure out how to behave within it. And we're very proud of our military. I mean, that is something that is very patriotic about Americans, and we're not a pacifist nation. But I do think that basically it is how America is now trying to deal with the problem of its vulnerability. And I do think that, I'm not so optimistic or naive to think that if other people were elected next November, that everything could be reversed immediately. But I do think that Americans want to be friends with Europeans, and even the French. And tomorrow I'm going to Paris, and I will try to explain that. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I have a final
right.
tidbit. Okay, two more questions from the floor. One on that side, maybe. Oh, yes, there's somebody there.
Yeah.
You have asked a question already.
No.
Okay, you
This is
you
my
look
first.
like one who. I'm sorry. I'm short-sighted.
My name is Shirley Haasnoot. I'm a historian, and I was wondering, during your period as Minister of Foreign Affairs, during the Clinton administration, it was the only time, I think, in history that two genocides took place, one in Rwanda and one in former Yugoslavia, and a third one almost happened in Kosovo if the Americans wouldn't have interfered. You were talking about fighting evil, and that's the theme of your book. How did you feel about it? And is it really, I find it very hard to believe that a country like the United States of America, the most powerful country in the world, you said, and we all agree with, I'm sure, could not prevent it.
Well, we can take them one at a time. Bosnia was something that happened, and as I said earlier, the Europeans paid no attention to what was going on, and in fact helped to make it more of a problem by not paying any attention, and the first Bush administration paid no attention to it, and the first part of the Clinton administration had a very hard time paying attention to it, but ultimately we did and ended the ethnic cleansing. In Rwanda, the situation was quite different and very troublesome, and I spent a whole part of my book specifically talking about my period at the United Nations. And when I was writing it, I thought, well, I have to write all this for history, but it's not basically that interesting until what we see now in the way that the United Nations is called upon to create peacekeeping operations or to have mandates or who participates or what the chain of command is, were all discussions that we were going through in the early 90s when the United Nations kind of came back alive after the freeze of the Cold War. And there were real questions about how did any country vote for a peacekeeping operation, who would participate in it, who would pay for it, how would the troops be assembled. And we spent a great deal of time on that, and Rwanda, what happened, if I can say this, without enough notice being paid to it, generally, by high levels at the United Nations and by high levels in the United States government. We were partially occupied with a disaster in Somalia and with trying to deal with Bosnia, and all I can describe to you is what the meetings of the Security Council were like, where reports would come in which never truly described the horror of what was happening. We wanted to actually aid our NATO ally Belgium that wanted to get out of Rwanda, and were trying to figure out what to do when there was an explosion, when the plane of the Rwandan president was blown up, and I had instructions to vote for taking out the UN operation. I hated my instructions. I screamed at Washington about it. I got my instruction changed slightly, but by the time anybody had any instructions, the genocide had already happened. And it happened so quickly that I think no matter what we would have done, we couldn't have made a difference. But I wish, and I say this in my book, that I had screamed more. It wouldn't have made any difference, but at least I would have felt morally better than I do now, or than President Clinton does. But it's an example where the international community couldn't act fast enough. We then tried to create an African crisis response team that would be ready to go in, and tried to figure out if future things like that happen. I'm not sure that it still has been resolved. On Kosovo, I was Secretary of State, and I pushed until we, in fact, ended the ethnic cleansing in Kosovo with the help of the Dutch, and especially Foreign Minister Van Aertsen. We spent a lot of time on it. We coordinated. We worked very hard on the diplomacy of it. It was very difficult, but we ended it. But there are questions always about how rapidly the international community can act to end genocide. And hindsight is a wonderful talent, especially when practiced by journalists.
A final question from the audience. Somebody over there, yes.
Good evening, Madeleine. This might be a bit of a leading question, being a fellow Wellesley alum, but who do you think would make a good next president?
Well, I think any Democrat actually would. But I also hope that the time will come that an American woman will be president. And it would be nice if she came from Wellesley.
Would you, well, I have to phrase it, I understand very carefully. Would you serve under President Wesley Clark?
I would serve under any Democratic president because I believe in public service. I would also happily answer a telephone call for advice from the current administration, which is not interested.
I have a final tidbit that I read in the papers, talking about papers. What do you think of the revelation that your current president does not read papers anymore? It's no joke.
I'm not surprised.
He doesn't. He relies on Andy Card and Condi Rice.
Well, let me tell you what does, aside from a joke here. I think that one of the hardest parts when you are in office is time. There's the question of what you read and how it is presented to you. And the White House always does the following thing. This happened I saw it with President Carter and President Clinton. Actually, they never deliver newspapers. They deliver huge piles of clips, which are arranged according to subject, and they look at papers from all over the country. At least that's what President Clinton did. And was a great consumer. President Clinton had a huge curiosity and really read many things, and including books, etc. But I do think that every president has a different style of learning facts.
You're very polite.
Well, I don't want to have to seek political asylum in...
Thank you very much. We will ask Monique Knapen to say the final words.
Thank you so much, Madam Secretary, for your thought-provoking, frank, honest talk and for your answers. I think it is very clear that America is indispensable, but it's also very clear that it's indispensable that we have wise people, wise women, and I think I speak for everybody that there was here somebody very wise here tonight. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
There is one more thing. I'm sorry. One more thing. There's a little bit more. Only 2 minutes more. Another thank you for you, Jan, for your excellent introduction. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for moderating. Thank you for asking the questions. Thank you for Ambo Antos, the Dutch publisher of Madam Secretary. I think it's very important that they made a Dutch edition. There will be a reception on the second floor for guests of Ambo Antos, sponsors and friends and benefactors of the John Adams Institute. We welcome everybody to our upcoming events. In November we have 3 lectures. They're all great. The first one is on the 5th with Philip Kotler, an expert on marketing, and he will talk about city marketing and Amsterdam in particular. On November 13th we'll have the very talented author, fiction writer Jhumpa Lahiri. And on November 25th, we'll have this year's winner of the Hannah Arendt Prize, Michael Ignatieff. If you're interested, please sign up for these events quickly. We now still have tickets, and thank you for being with us tonight, and have a safe journey home. Thank you so much.